Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Carry On Friends, the Caribbean American Experience. I am so excited, well excited. I kind of said that for all the guests, but it's because I truly mean it. I am particularly excited to have Malene Barnett on the podcast. Malene is big bad artist around them place. And no, not dancehall artist, but the original type of artist. So, Malene, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Carrie Ann. I am super excited to talk to you today.
Oh, wow. So, why don't you tell the community of friends a little bit about who you are, Caribbean countries you represent, and the work that you do?
Sure. Well, I am a multidisciplinary artist, a textile designer, community builder, and now author of the book Crafted Kinship Inside the Creative Practices of Contemporary Black Caribbean Makers. My mother is from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and my father is Jamaican. I am based in Brooklyn, New York, but I grew up in a small town called Norwalk, Connecticut.
Ooh, me know about that small town. Oh, Maleni, I'm so excited to talk to you on so many levels. I have notes upon notes. Like in a previous lifetime, I worked with a textile designer, and her designs used to be at Knoll Designs, and she
What?
did, yes, my dear. And I was there knowing Weft and Warp, and they had a
What?
loom in at the studio. Back in 1999, no me the age myself, and they work on Quark for the patterns and all of these things. And then they worked with Prince Street and Bentley for carpet. And so,
Yes. I
yes, my
know
dear.
all them places. I know all of that.
Yes, my dear. I'm not gonna call the lady name live. Me tell you off the ear. As soon as it's a textile, I remember. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, I did this but it was a fun experience for me because I remember for the carpet when
Mhm.
the palms used to come in because it was
Yes.
like it was woven. So we had to like look at the color, sometimes the black. And that's when I learned when black has too much red in it. And if the dye lots are different, one have too much yellow, too much red. I was like,
Yes.
look at me with skills.
Oh my goodness. Yes, that is so funny. I mean, even though I went to FIT studying textile design, and that's where I discovered rug design. I didn't even know it was a profession. I said, what? I
Yep.
could do this, make money? Like I could draw, paint, and make these images and turn them into, objects that many people can experience. So
Yes.
it's still my love. I still love designing rugs.
Listen, I came up with a database to help this woman make sure she get her royalties, and they were royalties for the sales. So I'm like, But we're not talking about that person. We're talking about you. So
Yes.
Vincy, Yardi, heritage in your bones. Let's start off with tell me the first time you fell in love with being an artist, using your hands. I think you use your hands in some things,
Yes.
designing.
Yes.
Tell me what was
Yes.
that first experience where you're just like, I love this. I want to do
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I've been drawing ever since I was 8 years old. I got selected for an artistically talented program, and we would draw and paint on a weekly basis. And that's when I really started to connect with the materials, right? And I love to draw portraits. So I would draw my friends, I draw my cousin who was living with me at the time, my baby cousin. But check this out. It wasn't until I was an adult and I started looking at my paintings from childhood. I saw how I said, wait, all the skin tones are of white people, right? And I'm a dark brown girl, and my baby cousin, he was darker than me. So, but what I realized was back in that day, our teacher, she only taught us how to mix skin tones up to a certain shade. And so I wasn't even allowed to mix anything darker than a certain shade of brown. And so
Wow.
all my portraits were, of my white female friends at the time. And then I even had to change my cousin to look like a white baby. But even though that experience inspired my work, my studio practice now, I always loved to create and portraiture, still lives. I used to draw still lives of fabric,
Mm.
just because I love the folds and the how the way the light would hit it, not realizing later in my career that I would be designing fabrics, right? So I studied painting and photography at SUNY Purchase. So when it was time for college, I had a very supportive art teacher. May she rest in peace. She passed away last year, but she was
Oh,
super supportive of my work, and she made sure we had our portfolio ready. She back in the day was photographing our work via slides. There was no
mm-hmm.
digital cameras and nothing like that. But when it was time for art school, she was like, "You're going to go to art school." It wasn't like a question, like, "Are you going to go to art school?" And so then, of course, I did. And, I went to SUNY Purchase, studied painting and photography for 2 years. It wasn't enough for me. So then I transferred to FIT, studied fashion illustration, later on got the bachelor's in textile design. And that's when I knew I found my love for making
Wow.
objects. Yeah.
Wow. I really love that story because for the last couple years I don't want to say obsessed, but I've been obsessing with baby Carrie. Because there's this innocence and freedom that I felt I had at that young age. And I go back to what everyone would comment and say is peculiar, like, oh, that's just Carrie. She loved chat, all these
Yeah.
things. And, like those were early glimpses of things that we'd come to
Hmm.
enjoy. So in hearing that story, I feel the same way. Like we innocently were doing
Hmm.
things, but it was really what was already placed in us to do. We just needed to be nurtured along the path.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, listen, I come from a lineage of makers. My mother, she used to make macrame wall hangings. She taught
Mm.
pottery. We need curtains, she made them. You need clothes, she made them. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, she was also a fashion designer. My auntie, same. So the making is just in my DNA. So it just made sense for me to just flourish in the art in the way that I have.
Wow. So now talk to me about what it was like growing up in a home where you had a Jamaican parent and a St. Vincent parent. A
Mhm.
lot of times I have people on the podcast who are either, all their parents come from one country. And,
Yeah,
so like, what was that like in terms of we're all Caribbean and have similar things, but they're also very distinct things from each places. And
yeah.
maybe how did that influence your art or your maker gene?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you this. My parents divorced when I was 5, right? So, but I still saw my father on the weekends. He lived nearby. And so my mother, I was in the house again with my mother and my siblings. And I think the difference was, no, I'm not to say the difference. They both were very proud Caribbean people through the music, through the food, And to be honest, I didn't know my parents were from the Caribbean when I was a kid. And the only reason I started to figure this out, it's funny, is because people would come to me as a child, people would come to me and say, "Where's your mother from?" I'm like, "Why are you asking me that?" It's because she has an accent. Well, for me, she didn't have an accent.
She sounded
Daddy didn't have
normal.
an accent. Mommy didn't have an accent. That's just how they talk. And so I had to find out the answer one day. Like, "Mommy, why are people always asking me where you're from?" But listen, they would play the soca, they played the reggae. My mother made bakes, made my rice and peas. The food was always present in our upbringing. And now looking back, I see those are the things that she brought with her. But my father would go to his house. He was his Ital diet, Bob Marley and all the roots reggae always on repeat. And the good thing is that we did stay connected to his side of the family, even though they were divorced, which is very rare. But as I got older, when I started to learn more and understand, like, oh, daddy is from Jamaica. Oh, my Jamaican side of the family, there was always about the parties and the get-togethers. They planned the family reunion, so we would go to Jamaica when I was a child. On my mother's side, she was the anchor family where everyone came to her because basically my maternal grandmother migrated to the US, and that's how my mother came and her siblings. So all her siblings were here. And so our connection with St. Vincent was very minimal. And I only went there once as a child, and that was the first time my mother had returned back when I was 15.
Wow.
And so, but she took us down there, went to Grenada, went to Barbados, and I would make images on my disc. You remember the Kodak disc camera? So I had one of those, and I would make images down there, and I turned those images into paintings.
Wow.
Yeah, so I was already inspired by the landscape because I remember the first time going, and I was like, "Oh wow, it's like black people everywhere." It was so colorful. And I loved the heat and sunshine, and my uncle had a beautiful house, and I was like, "Oh my God, you could have a house and a guest house like on the same property?" I didn't experience that growing up. We just had one house, and we grew up by the beach, but it was just one house. And
Mhm.
so, and my uncle was he had a spice business, and I always remember the packages that came to the house that smelled like spices. Up, package from Grenada. That's from Uncle Ben. So these are the memories, that I had growing up. But now I could talk about them with pride. I didn't know what that meant as a child. And I think
Mhm.
it's kind of good because then you don't see yourself as different. But it wasn't until, to be honest, high school is when you really started to see the difference. Because if you think about it, I'm dating myself. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and it was not cool to say it was from Jamaica. It was not cool to say it was from the Caribbean, period, except when dance hall became a thing. The
Yes.
music changed it for all of us.
Yes. I came to the US right as that became a thing. So I came to the US in 93 and I walked around the school and I was the kid fresh off the boat or fresh off the plane and then they were be like, "Where you come from? Kingston." And then everybody was from Kingston. Everybody was from Kingston. I was just like, "You all can't be from Kingston. This
Kingston.
is this is not."
Yes.
So I came right as that became a thing and it was I can't even explain it. It was just like pride upon pride. And then the school I
Mm-hmm.
went to had beer. It's like all the Caribbean families who came into Brooklyn landed in
Mm-hmm.
Flatbush and their kids went to this school. So
Mm-hmm.
all even the teachers were Caribbean. I remember Miss Sylvester, the math teacher from Grenada, the Jamaican teachers. So it was for me, it was a different experience because I just
Yeah.
came from Jamaica where it's only Jamaican teachers, only Jamaican
I
students
see.
to now, there's this accent that, oh, that person is Trini. I remember the first time I heard David Levy on the radio, I
Oh
was like,
yes.
who is that? Is he,
Yes.
my mom said, "Is he Jamaican?" I said, I don't think so. He kind of so, but I'm not sure. And then he was like, "You're from Barbados." I was like, "Oh, okay."
Yes.
So that was like the culture shock for me, but
Yeah.
you're right, the music made being Caribbean cool.
Yeah.
So my gosh, that's the other art. So you have book out. Me love the book. Everybody me love the book. The book pretty. It feel good. The texture of the book is just so nice. It is
Thank you.
called Crafted Kinship, right? Inside the
Mm-hmm.
creative practices of contemporary Black Caribbean makers. Now, thank you for sending me this book. I've learned about so many artists just looking at this book.
Oh.
And some of them say, "Oh, that's nice. It in our store, me can buy it." I mean, really nice artwork. And um, I made some notes because
Okay,
as I
good.
was flipping through it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's a book where you sit and read through. For me, it's been a book
Mm-hmm.
of inspiration. Just the the concept of the book, as I told you, has inspired me, because you have a collection of people, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, maybe me should do something with a podcast there too, right?
There you
But
go.
but one of the first things that stood out to me was Andrea Chong's response to the question, "What part of Caribbean identity or art practice do you think speaks to what is needed in the world right now?" I think this is a common question you asked, but
Mm-hmm.
her response stood out to me. She talks about how other Black people look at the Caribbean as a source of inspiration. I was like, "Oh, really?" And then she gave a specific example of being in Mauritius and the impact of reggae there. And then she also talks about how what is needed because of how the Caribbean is. She didn't have to explain her being because says, "Well, if I mix up down there, right?" So nobody's
Mm-hmm.
never gonna ask you like, "What are you?" That type of thing, right? We're no
Yes.
business. We're no business. Because she looks different. Whereas in America, you need to define like,
Yeah.
what are you? So in asking these questions, and hearing or getting the responses from the different artists, like tell me what was the impact of like seeing and hearing some of these responses from the artists as you were doing this project. How did that impact you in this process?
Well, just like the book inspired you, all of the makers have inspired me and it really have truly helped me think about my practice in a different way. This was a collaborative process because you have to think, Carrie Ann, I started this book because it was what I was looking for when I was in grad school. I wanted to be in conversation with a group of makers who were all already thinking about the Caribbean from these different perspectives. And I created these themes of kinship in the book where it talks about the different ways of being. It has truly helped me to talk about my work in different ways. And I know for many of the makers in the book, it actually also helped them to really think about their practice. Because, when you're in the studio making, you're in your own world, you're in your process, but then to have to talk about it out loud to other people, it makes you really think about why, to your point, why am I doing this? Is this important? How are these words going to inspire not only myself, but to the global community? So yeah.
Listen, I have like when I tell you like notes, because I was flipping through because my first pass at the book was just looking at pictures. That's what I kind of gravitate to. And then once I've looked at the pictures, I was like, oh my God, these are like pretty. Just go flipping through and reading. There was this other aspect by Amina Major that
Mhm,
says, cultural memory is our survival. And that really speaks to me because when I first started the podcast, I kind of knew that there was an aspect of or this new
mhm,
storytelling tradition that I told myself, but I kind of said it, but I didn't actually know what does that really mean for me or how am I living that out, but I knew it in my mind. And now 10 years in, I'm like it's a little bit more clear. So that really spoke to me when she said that because this idea like I think we take for granted that we always have culture and
mhm.
it will always be around, and I've studied anthropology to know that no, it won't always be around if you aren't doing the things to ensure that it stays around. And so
Yeah.
that really spoke to me. So in terms of the work of these artists, right, when you think of this new generation of artists versus those you came up with learning about, right, Eurocentric American,
Mhm,
Caribbean Edna Manley.
mhm.
Watson was one that I remember in the seventh grade in high school.
Oh,
Don't
cool.
ask me, you know. But that's also what I appreciated about growing up in Jamaica. We had to do these art projects and do write ups. So I'm appreciative that I can at least name two people. But when we but when we think about, like artists in this way,
Yeah.
I appreciate that you do this book because I can't say I would have known anything about any of these artists if you did not put this collection together.
Mm. Mhm.
And it's not to say that they aren't there,
Yeah.
but it's the same thing with the podcast. People don't necessarily, because information has proliferated, where do you go now to get that information all assembled and
Yeah. Yeah, because
given to you?
yeah,
Go ahead.
very much so. That was part of the reason why I felt the book format is so important because to your point, we have so many avenues from the internet, social media to find information, right? And we're constantly doing research and gathering piece from here, save a post, do that. But when you have it in one envelope, right? It's something that you could constantly go back to your point. It's not something where you have to start from the beginning and go to the end. You could start in the back, middle, the front, and guess what? 10 years from now, when you go back to that book, you're going to still learn from it. You're going to be inspired, right? There's going to be a new connection that's formed. And so I feel as Black people, especially a part of the diaspora, it's so important that we create these archival objects because we are the generation who are going to, I think we'll be part of the first part of the generation that are going to be speaking the truth and filling in the gaps of our history. And so, how do we do that? In multiple forms. And because we have access to so much now, we have no excuse not to make these archival objects. And like how you're doing with your podcast, in a book, in a movie, there's so many different ways. And I hope that the storytelling in this format to your inspires as many people to think about, what can I now archive and package so the community could be involved and be inspired. So it's just a continuous act of giving and care, because I
Mm-hmm.
believe our creating archives is a sense of care, right?
Absolutely.
And the more that we do it in these different ways, the broader our stories and experiences are going to be. Because one of the things I made a point with the book is that we all learn differently. We all learn differently, and I didn't want the book to be. I wanted it to be accessible to
Mm-hmm.
many types of readers, learners, and it's multi generational. There are some people in the beginning of crafting their kinship to their work, the community, to the landscape of the Caribbean. And there are some makers who have been doing that for years.
Yeah.
And so it was really important to create the space for both to be celebrated, as well as space for the ancestors, because there's two profiles that are ancestors in the book, Althea McNish and Ronald Moody. And these are
Mm-hmm.
names that maybe you may have heard of or you may not, but they're not your quote unquote household name.
Right.
And, we always have to show gratitude to the ancestors for how we're here because of them,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. It's kind of like the quote from Donald Baugh that says,
Uh-huh.
"Learn by doing and don't be afraid." That, let
That's
me tell
right.
you, I was like,
That's right.
highlight, highlight.
Highlight, highlight. Oh, good, because it's so how we have all our sayings. Now these will become the new ones that
Hmm.
we could hold on to and repeat.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of our words.
Yeah. I feel like this book, like, it was intentional that I didn't like try to read it and study it for this. It was like, let the page guide me. Let
Yes.
like whatever photo I was scanning through, and then that's how I saw Andrea's. And I know that you asked that question to other people, but for some
Yeah.
reason her stood out, and that was the book speaking to me as like, "Psst, my
Yeah.
girl, focus on this," and it's a book where I feel like if you need inspiration, it's
Hmm.
like something you pick up. And the inspiration you get today may not be the inspiration you get tomorrow, because, like, when I see how the book tick, I want tick book, My gosh. But
Yes, it is.
but the photos are beautiful. The artwork is just like, wow, this
Yeah.
is amazing. And it's also like, you know, Caribbean people are going with things.
Yes, yes, yes. Isn't it nice seeing the makers in a different setting, not just like your traditional portrait, pose for the camera? Like you see them making, you see their process, you see the messy studios, right?
Yes,
And I
yes,
intentionally made everyone's profile different. Like,
yes.
it's not a cookie cutter type of experience type of book, because we're all different. And I wanted to celebrate the beauty of our differences.
Listen, when I saw that man on the loom, I was like, oh, I gotta bring this up. I was like, I remember that life.
And you notice I went far. Like, remember, most of the makers are based in the US,
Right.
right? Of course, we have many makers in the Caribbean,
Hmm.
but I also went to West Africa because there was a large Caribbean community that went back.
Yeah.
And, Joanna Bramble, who's the weaver that's in the book, she's from Dominica and Guadeloupe, and she's working with the Senegalese weavers doing the manjack weaving. This is part
Mm,
of our culture, right? And so, and also there's makers from Belize, Panama, you know, Caribbean culture it's spread out, as we know. It's not just focused on the actual land, the region itself.
yeah.
And that's also what I wanted to make sure that, I highlight. Of course, there's makers in Europe as well, in Canada. We're everywhere.
I know. I know. I truly, truly enjoyed the book. I'm looking at which question I'm gonna ask you yet. So, what advice would you give to someone trying to discover, or like you mentioned, some people are like earlier in their maker journey. So generally, like, what advice would you give to anyone who's like, Me no know if me fi start. Me no know if me creative. Me no know. Me no know. Me no good like Malene. Me no good like because that is a thing. We can eat. We can always tell people don't compare yourself, but it's human. We do it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
like, how do they get past that? Some people are gonna look at Malene 10 years, right,
Hmm.
versus not seeing Malene in year one, right? So
Yeah,
we can't help do that level of comparison because it happens naturally, right?
yeah.
So what would you encourage someone
Hmm.
to do to not look at where someone else is in their journey, but just to be kind to their inner artist who's a
Yeah,
baby that's they're
yeah.
nurturing.
I say the first thing is just take a class.
Mm,
Take a class of just any medium process that is of interest, right? Let go of all outcomes. Don't go in with the intention that you're going to complete a project, you're going to make your best work. Just go in with the intention, I want to learn and I want to build community. I want to build a community of makers who are going to help support my journey. That is the key. Because I remember in grad school, Carrie Ann, I remember one of my professors told me, guess what? You're not here to make your best work. You're only
mm,
here to discover who it is you want to become.
mm,
And it's going to take time to figure that out. You're not going to figure it out. So if you already know that you're not going to be making your best work, you most likely will not complete a project, then go in there and learn and have fun. I think one of the things we forget about art is that it is fun, and it's
mm,
also something that's helpful for our mind. It's not all about like, oh, I made this replica of this person, or the object looks exactly like it is. No, it's about process. I
mm,
learned something. How did you feel doing that? I felt so free and grounded. And then now I'm thinking about, you know what? I want to do blah blah blah. It
mm,
art making is it, I think it forces us to dream bigger because there's this meditative moments that happen while we're in process of making art. So just take a class, any class. That's exactly what I did. That's how I got into clay. I took a class.
Listen, let go of all outcomes. If me could have let me insert gem sound effects here, like I think I think that's barrier for us as Caribbean people because we've come from a culture of excellence, right? So
Mhm.
everything must be right, everything must be good. You get 95 with the next 5 days. You're supposed to get like so we this idea of letting go of outcomes when a lot of us weren't really
Mhm.
nurtured in that way.
Yeah.
And I think even for me, just seeing that, I think that is also part of the art therapy, right? Because art
Mhm.
is like, yeah, draw it, paint it, and ta-da,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
Exactly. When was the last time you allowed yourself to just play and just do and not
Yeah,
worry? We're not selling it. You don't have to frame it. It doesn't have to become anything except the marks that you put on that paper.
yeah. I love that. I love that.
Hmm.
Thank you for that, Armstrong. I have my last question. How can All right. So, me never always see myself as a creative. I was thinking, when I think of creative people, I think of artists who use them hands like you. But let's think broadly in terms
Hmm.
of creators, right? How can how can creatives make their work personal while honoring like culture and cultural traditions? How can we do more than that, more of that, especially if we're in this age of digital archiving and
Yeah.
preservation of culture?
Yeah, I think first we have to talk to our elders in our families, have those, the everyday conversation. If you do have a grandparent, if you have an elder aunt, or even just a family friend, start recording them. You see, I didn't have experience with either of my grandparents. They both died when my father was 5, and then when I was a baby, my maternal grandmother. And so I have my mother and all her siblings. And so as I've gotten older, and the way I personalize my art practice, I'm having more conversations with all of them,
Mm,
asking them about their migration experience.
mm-hmm.
What was that like? What was grandma like? What did we call her? Why did she come to the US? What happened when you didn't speak to her for 9 years? You didn't see her because she left all her children with granny. And then we start talking about, gosh, imagine what that was like. There was no therapy. She did all this for you guys, and she didn't even get a chance to experience of what she wanted to create for you. But look, all my aunties and my uncle and my mother, they're in their 80s, or close to it. They outlived my grandmother by many years. She died when she was 55. And
Wow.
look what she had created for them. So my point is, like, look at those stories and the objects that are in your home. All of that matters. I'm very much interested in looking at. That's why my mother, she gave me this piece of lace recently, and I created a whole ceramic sculpture around it. The doilies. You remember doilies? These doilies were on the table, they were on the back of couches. They decorated our spaces, but they were also a sense of pride.
Yes.
And so those things, what I'm saying is that we may overlook these everyday objects, but this is by looking at that and the experiences is how we could personalize our experience and then share it.
Yeah.
Share it.
I love it. I love it. Well, Malene, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Everybody, I'm going to put a link to where you can get this nice, lovely book. It is just really beautiful. And it's inspired me, so I know it will inspire you. And so, Malene, tell everyone where they could find you on the internet.
Well, you could go to my website, MaleneBarnett.com. That's MaleneBarnett. And my Instagram is at Malene.Barnett. Pretty much those are the two places where you can find me.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. So at the end of the show, I love to say walk good. And we still are gonna walk good, but guess what? Melania and I is going into the after show. And the after show is only available if you're in the community. So come over there with us.